swallow a piece of Syria up here, called the Golan Heights. To the east, Israel had seized the West Bank, and in the south, it now occupied Egypt's entire Sinai Peninsula, a huge expanse of desert. The key to the Egyptian plan was a surprise coordinated ground attack on Israel. The Syrians would attack on the Golan at exactly the same moment as the Egyptians struck along the entire length of the canal. But Shazdly knew that no matter how stunned the Israelis might be by this two-pronged offensive, they would soon counterattack with their most lethal weapon, their air force. And that was where the SAM missiles came in. Shazdly concentrated his SAMs along the Suez Canal. These missiles could bring down any Israeli planes that came within 15 miles. The SAMs and regular artillery guns would create a protective umbrella, shown here in red, under which Egyptian boats and infantry could cross safely. They would then seize the forts of the Bar-Lev line and secure a strip of land a few miles deep into the Sinai. The date of the attack was set for October the 6th, when the tides would give the most favorable conditions for crossing the canal. The eastern bank of the canal now became a battlefield. The Israelis manning the forts sprayed machine gun fire at their Egyptian attackers to try and stem the tide. But within 2 hours, 23,000 of Egypt's infantry were on the east bank and had advanced up to 1 mile into Sinai. But the Israelis were sure that their air force would come to the rescue. The first Israeli jets were sent in at 4 p.m., flying low over the desert. But as they approached the canal, they found themselves under attack from the ground. The Egyptian SAM missiles and anti-aircraft guns caused havoc. As Israeli planes were shot down that afternoon, it soon became clear that Egypt's elaborate air defense umbrella was working. Israel's single greatest weapon, its air force, was virtually powerless to hold back the Egyptian onslaught. By the 10th of October, 4 days into the war, there was an astonishing turnaround. The Syrians were in full flight from here on the Golan. Israel's tanks chased them into Syria itself. And soon the Israelis were within shelling distance of the Syrian capital, Damascus, just 30 miles off that way. Syrian President Assad sent a message to President Sadat, urging the Egyptian leaders to do something to relieve the pressure on Syria. And now Sadat made a momentous decision. Down on the Suez Canal, Sadat ordered his men to thrust way beyond the strong defense line they'd established on the east bank of the canal. Their objective? Strategic passes through these mountains. But to get there, they'd have to leave the safety of their SAM missile umbrella way behind them. It was a high-risk strategy, and Shazdly was appalled by the decision. But Sadat was immovable. What followed would be one of the biggest tank battles in history. The Egyptians on the east bank of the canal were split into 2 armies, one in the north and one in the south. 100,000 men and about 1,000 tanks, well dug in and well defended by minefields. They looked impregnable. But one of Sharon's patrols had discovered a narrow gap, just 1 mile wide, between the 2 armies at this spot, where the Suez Canal joined a large salt lake. Sharon was ordered to push through here with his tanks, widen the gap, and secure a corridor through to the canal. The Israelis would bridge the canal, and hundreds of tanks would then pour across it and fan out north and south to cut off the Egyptians from behind. The Egyptians' positions on the eastern canal bank would then be untenable. For the Israelis, the whole operation would be fraught with danger. The biggest threat was an Egyptian stronghold here called Chinese Farm. It was just north of the planned Israeli corridor. Sharon had to neutralize the Egyptians at Chinese Farm if the Israeli plan was to succeed. This is the Golan here, once part of Syria, occupied by Israel since 1967. The area is no more than 15 miles wide, and it ends with a steep slope down to the River Jordan. To Israelis, the Golan was a vital buffer between their heartland and Syria. Despite this, only 170 Israeli tanks and 400 soldiers were stationed in the front line on the Golan. Most of the Israeli forces were here in the north, because Israeli commanders felt this was the most likely place for any Syrian assault. But when the Syrians made their move, their 1,200 tanks and 60,000 men attacked all the way along the line. 6 hours into the battle, the Syrians' overwhelming strength was beginning to tell, and their tanks broke through down here in the more lightly defended south. By nightfall, they'd almost reached the western edge of the heights, where they could look down on the River Jordan. If Syrian tanks could now seize the vital bridges across the Jordan, they'd be able to pour across the river into Israel's heartland. Here on the Golan, the Syrians were perilously close to Israel's main villages and towns across the Jordan, just a few miles' drive away. The Golan had to be Eleazar's priority. So he ordered the army and the air force to put everything they had into throwing the Syrians back. Some tank units would attack halfway along the Golan to relieve the pressure on Nafak, the Israeli HQ on the heights. Other Israeli tanks had already been ordered to go up onto the southern Golan, where the Syrians were closest to Israel's heartland. Their commander had been told bluntly, "You are Israel's last hope." But one thing in their favor was that the Syrians had made an extraordinary decision to halt up on the high ground rather than press on towards the River Jordan. It gave the Israelis vital breathing room to cross the river and move up towards the Golan.